So last night I saw one battle after another, and this has to be one of my favorite movies of the year so far. It's so good. But while this movie is this really funny and exciting and thrilling experience, there's so much detail politically, socially, and thematically through the super complex characters, their complicated relationships, and the details of the story itself. So I've done a ton of research on the making of the film, the characters, the original book, and the true political history, and I can't wait to share everything here with you. So to break this movie down, we're going to use three themes. One, collapse of revolution, where we'll discuss the original novel, the inspiration of 60s activism and oppression, and the meaning of the French 75. Two, inherited consequence, where we'll discuss the reason for Lockjaw and Perfidia's attraction, Perfidia's psychology, Perfidia and Bob's differences, the meaning of the film's title, Willa's character, and Sensei Sergio's network. And three, irony of prejudice, where we'll discuss Lockjaw's obsession with Perfidia, Lockjaw's psychology, the Christmas Adventures Club, and the ending with Willa's fate and Perfidia's letter. And so much more. Hope you enjoy. Theme number one, collapse of revolution. So the first thing I need to discuss is the book that inspired this movie, because the writer-director of this film, Paul Thomas Anderson, used this novel to establish the major themes he wanted to explore in his movie. So I'm going to pull a quote directly from his interview with Shade Studios on the novel. It's called Vineland. Vineland was a story that I loved very much, and there's a central premise that we stole. What happens when revolutionaries scatter? And what happens when one of them, Bob, ends up in the Northern California woods and the past comes back to haunt them? But rather than directly adapt the book, I just took what I needed and combined it with some of my other stories and just started running with it over the years. Vineland by Thomas Pynchon was published in 1990, and as Paul describes in this same interview, it's a beautifully challenging novel, with many points of discussion about counterculture revolutionaries up against an oppressive government. The book is set in 1984. The year of Ronald Reagan's re-election, the dead center of his presidency and influence over the country. And as the book describes, it was the time of more aggressive conservatism, with more severe punishments for any sort of resistance. And through conservative campaigns and media, they largely rebranded left-wing political movements into rising forms of chaos and a threat to an ideal, more traditional America. The book also often flashes back to the 1960s to reflect thematically on how this shift happened in America. The late 60s and early 70s marked the fracturing and end of many anti-war activist groups, civil rights groups, and feminist groups. The Black Panthers were infiltrated, police brutality was at a high, and civil rights leaders were assassinated like Fred Hampton and Martin Luther King Jr. And because the state and certain parts of society were so unforgiving and unapologetic, many of these groups would burn out, or fold, or disband, or even betray, secretly giving in and working with the enemy. So I'm sure you can see topically and even narratively where the film is pulling its commentary from. And now I want to get into more of the similarities between plot and characters between the book and the film. So to get more specific, the story in Vineland follows these counterculture revolutionaries who took strong action in the 1960s but fell apart and scattered across the country when the state began to exercise its control in a much more unrelenting way. And super similarly to the film, the story of the novel revolves around a father, a daughter, and a long-lost mother who has betrayed her activist group in the 60s, having been allured by a federal agent who is the villain of the story. So ultimately, with this film, Paul is highlighting the similarity of modern oppression and activism with oppression and activism between the 1960s and 1980s, using examples in his film that very starkly reflect current social and political issues, like immigration most notably. Almost to the point where some scenes and visuals could have been pulled directly from news clips through the 2020s. And Paul uses this modern American backdrop to explore ideas of counterculture, prejudice, and generational progress. And Leonardo DiCaprio actually sums this up really nicely in this interview with Fandango. The film is a reference to counterculture revolutionaries of the late 60s, but what would happen if that was happening today? Combined with the next generation of young people and how they would react to our actions. And now that we've captured the inspiration for what this film is about, I want to continue with DiCaprio's words to introduce us to the actual story of the film, starting with the inspiration for our main character's far left-wing revolutionary group, the French 75. The French 75 is loosely based on the Weather Underground from the late 1960s, which is sort of a mixed race group of people that were fighting against, civil rights, Vietnam at the time. But what if we transpose that to modern times? And the story of that is people who are speaking out for what is right, people who were speaking out for justice, but went too far. And a lot of those people ended up scattering away like rats in a subway all across America and hiding away and going off grid and being afraid of government forces coming back after them. And this is a sort of modern retelling of that. So as Leo describes, the story begins with a modern iteration of the Weather Underground of the 1960s, the French 75, specifically named after the French 75mm field gun of 1897, which has historically been symbolic in France of revolution, innovation, and fearless, violent resistance. And for the members of the French 75, we have Ghetto Pat, later renamed as Bob Ferguson, and his romantic partner, Perfidia Beverly Hills, fighting alongside Deandra and many other members. And for the first act of this movie, as I mentioned, we're just watching a modern iteration of a militant 1960s revolutionary activist group. The team are bombing banks, blacking out an electric grid, and freeing migrants from a detention center. And as we as the audience watch the team orchestrate these events, we are introduced to this very strange relationship between Ghetto Pat's partner, Perfidia, and the villain of the film, military officer Stephen J. Lockjaw. And this is easily one of the most mysterious elements to the film. So let's break this relationship down. In theme number 2, inherited consequence. So basically, at first, while Perfidia has Lockjaw at gunpoint, she forces him to get an erection as the migrants are escorted out. And during this encounter, there's this bizarre undertone of flirtation between the two of them. And later on, we see Lockjaw spying on Perfidia through binoculars, of course, for work purposes, but simultaneously, he's sexually exciting himself with her body. And eventually, the two of them collide when Lockjaw tracks Perfidia into a bathroom stall, catching her in the act of planting a bomb. And the two of them strike a deal where Lockjaw keeps his mouth shut if Perfidia sleeps with him at a motel. So before I move forward, we have to discuss what the nature and dynamic of this relationship is. Why is Lockjaw putting his job on the line for a woman he's attracted to? And is Perfidia attracted to Lockjaw? And the best person to hear this from is the closest thing to Perfidia herself, Teyana Taylor, who describes this relationship in this same interview with Fandango. They were just toxic, but I also think Perfidia was so Perfidia that you never really knew when it was genuine and when it wasn't. I think Perfidia was trying to get her way with a lot of things, so she played a lot of games. I feel like they both were bad, and that's what attracted them to each other, I think she really loved her Ghetto Pat, but I think Lockjaw was a good time. Lockjaw, I feel like, matched her energy more. And while Teyana does give some explanation to this, I do think she's trying to keep things as cryptic and subjective as possible. So I think there's more we can interpret out of this relationship through the themes of the original book and what the equivalent characters of Perfidia and Lockjaw in that novel represent. So a major theme in the book is how one generation will inherit the consequences of the previous generation that birthed them. So for example, if two parents are militant civil rights activists and they put their safety and livelihoods at risk, the safety and livelihood of their child will inevitably be at risk as well once they're born. And there's this immediate loss of innocence for that child. It's as if the blood on the parents' hands gets carried across to the child's hands without their awareness or consent at all. And of course, this theme is demonstrated in the film with Willa, who is born into a life of hiding beyond her comprehension. But the book dives much more deeply into how this inherited consequence and trauma can corrupt the developing mind of that younger generation and can actually sometimes give them feelings of wanting to surrender to or join the other side, the oppressor, all for a sense of security, stability, and belonging that they never felt they really had. And this is exactly what happens to the equivalent of Perfidia's character in the book. Her name is Fernesi. She betrays her activist group to help a federal agent who is Lockjaw's equivalent. His name is Brock Vond. And I strongly believe that the movie is making the exact same point with Perfidia's character. And the most hinting indication of this is when Perfidia's mother tells Pat, you are so unsuitable for my daughter. My child comes from a whole line of revolutionaries, and you look so lost. This moment is making the distinction between Perfidia and Pat. Perfidia has inherited the compounded trauma and circumstances of multiple generations, which leads her to impulsive, irresponsible, and contradictory behavior. That same concept that the book captures, where the traumatized child feels a natural gravitational pull towards the enemy. All of which Pat is not associated with because he is likely the first of his generation to put himself at risk for this cause, unlike Perfidia. And this is what causes a rift in their partnership, especially when baby Charlene, Willa, is born. And additionally, Perfidia is faced with postpartum depression. So this storm of conflicting feelings brews within Perfidia's already unstable psyche, causing her to be, as she says, jealous of her own baby and to spoil the bank robbery, which leads to her arrest. And it's these conflicted feelings that eventually lead her to expose her team in exchange for lesser jail time, when originally she was so tirelessly dedicated to the cause. At the Q&A with Shade Studios, Teyana expands on this. I think you see this woman in survival mode, dealing with postpartum depression. And I think where she and Bob disconnect is, Bob is not hearing the cries. He's not hearing the cries for help. I also think that even 16 years later, Willa is going through our baggage, what we left, like our past is coming back to haunt not only Bob, but his only child. And I think Teyana put it beautifully here, where she describes the inherited trauma of Perfidia that carries through down to her daughter Willa, and that through running theme of inherited consequence found in both the book and the movie. Her quote also provides a sound explanation to the film's title, One Battle After Another. Every next generation faces the next battle of inherited consequence. And these consequences induce a series of internal psychological battles in the mind of the individual. And as the story demonstrates, the life of an activist every day is one battle to the next, with family, community, oneself, and the oppressor. And I do want to eventually discuss the psyche of Colonel Lockjaw and the reason for his obsession with Perfidia, but I think it'll be a little easier when I reach the Christmas Adventures Club and how that all ties together. So for now, because I'm talking about the next generation, let's talk about Willa's character. So once Perfidia surrenders her team, is put on witness protection, and eventually escapes to Mexico, Ghetto Pat, known as Bob Ferguson, must live a life in hiding with his daughter Charlene, who is now named Willa. And Bob, for the last 16 years, resorts to drugs, alcohol, and late nights to cope with the seclusion, depression, and anxiety of living on the run with his child. Therefore, Willa is the embodiment of stripped innocence. With Willa having to prematurely take on a parenting role of her own parent, she develops a complex of believing she has life completely figured out, while being massively unaware of the true danger her life could be in at any moment. This is why she carries a phone, even though it welcomes a major threat to her and her father's life. She also carries this deep feeling of resentment for her father for the childhood and teenhood that was largely stolen from her by circumstance. And as the story goes along, more and more of her innocence is taken from her at an accelerating rate. The only dependable figure of guidance for Willa, who plays an enormous role in her well-being and inner peace, is Sensei Sergio. Not only by the techniques and exercises of calm and courage, which he's mastered and is teaching her, of course, but also by his nature of nobility and humanity. And his kind-heartedness isn't only demonstrated by helping them, but by taking the time to introduce Bob to so many of them and their children and their babies as he and Bob navigate through the halls and the rooms of his home. It also explains his extensive network of connections through this sanctuary city that he lives in, who eventually help Bob escape the hospital. And Benicio Del Toro takes this a step further, as he talks about the dynamic between his and DiCaprio's characters. There's also an element of my character being a fan of his character. You know, there's that moment where he wants to have proof. He wants to say, hey, I was here with you, trying to get from point A to point B. I want to take a picture. I want to take a selfie. They're both good people and good human beings, and different in dealing with stress. And that's what makes a good balance. Ocean waves. And all these characters, despite some of their imperfections, demonstrate these glowing examples of humanity, nobility, and altruism. And it's all in this fight for belonging. Sensei is providing a sense of belonging for the undocumented immigrants. Perfidia is seeking a sense of belonging within the legacy of her lineage. And Bob is fostering a sense of belonging for his daughter as best as he can. Even Lockjaw, on the opposite side of the spectrum, is desperately seeking a sense of belonging, which DiCaprio actually touches on in a quote I want to share in theme number 3, Irony, a Prejudice. When I read the script, it just did a beautiful job of seamlessly weaving in this political extremism that's going on in our world right now, this sort of mirror to society. This idea that we're in such a polarized world and everyone's trying to belong somehow. You even see Lockjaw in this idea of the Christmas Adventures Club, which is the most insane sort of Masonic racist cult you could ever imagine. Even the way the character of Lockjaw is filmed and written in the movie, he's always framed in this isolated manner, often alone, often in wide open spaces, often being spoken down to by his enemies and patronized by his superiors. And what's created is this desperate cry and claw to finally fit in and be accepted. And when you put it into those words, it's the same journey of his enemy that he's trying to incriminate: immigrants, minorities, and the underprivileged, fighting to fit in, be accepted, and be treated fairly. And the glaring irony in Lockjaw's character is further highlighted in his admiration for a black woman, his obsession with Perfidia, a strongly representative image of black female beauty. The smooth brown skin tone, the muscle definition, the curves, the facial bone structure, there's a deep admiration he has for black beauty and a black woman, but his desperation for belonging overshadows that desire to make peace. And this theme of glaring irony within racism and prejudice is even further emphasized by the group that Lockjaw is dying to be a part of, the Christmas Adventures Club. The Christmas Adventures Club is this Masonic white supremacist organization that just oozes irony and paradox in their values and their behaviors. Firstly, the Christmas Adventures Club is named after a Christian holiday, which is a religion that's meant to express values of togetherness, forgiveness, and virtue, which of course is the opposite of what they stand for, obviously. And secondly, the call that they have, Hail Saint Nick, which is this ironic combination of their kind of neo-Nazism with the symbol of a Christian saint. And thirdly, the way they describe minorities in a way where they are lesser, even mentioning that they want to cleanse the country of that heritage, when in many ways they also imply that these individuals are needed to hold the country together economically. And I want to actually continue that previous quote from DiCaprio on the Christmas Adventures Club to smoothly transition us into the conclusion of the film. The most insane sort of Masonic racist cult you could ever imagine. And you still say, does something like this really exist in society? Is there a place, this underground world with these foul men talking about cleansing society? Like, Jesus, there's something tactile about that that's so scary and felt so real. But within the context of that, Paul Thomas Anderson made this incredible sort of epic story of people trying to find, certainly in Bob, Sensei, and Willa, loving their neighbor, loving someone in their community. I hate to say this film has a message, but for me, there's an undercurrent of being good to one another and helping each other out in the hardest and most polarized times. And I thought it was a beautiful thing. And this undercurrent of love DiCaprio describes does sort of permeate through every character in the film. It's the reason why Lockjaw wouldn't kill his biological daughter and actually kisses the photo of Willa in Bob's home. Why that indigenous bounty hunter decided to save Willa from that white nationalist compound that he brought her to. And why Willa restores faith in her father after this trauma-induced lapse in trust in that final scene at gunpoint. And I think this whole idea is encapsulated in my opinion, the most touching moment of the entire movie: Perfidia's letter to her daughter. Our first moment of true vulnerability from Perfidia, admitting to her feelings of inner conflict, which we described earlier, and her front of a tough exterior in real moments of fear. But ultimately, her hope for her daughter to carry on her legacy in a new way, her own way, a better way of fighting the next generation's battle after this one. Born into the crossfire of political extremism, finally seeing the pain of her mother's past, Willa carries on the legacy of her mother's lineage, her father's nobility, and her sensei's humanity in a self-determined path of peaceful protest, a living symbol of the unity and progress hopefully to come. Alright, that's my analysis. I know the conversation never really ends with a movie as dense as this one, so please share your ideas, your feelings, and any questions in the comments below. I'd love to discuss them. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later.